Hey guys, Tarke here, and today's video is all about this fellow above me, Mr. Champion, and is Mr. Champion underrated? Now, one thing before we get into this, and this is one thing with path building you do need to take into account, is it doesn't always calculate everything. So in this example, it's not calculating the extra damage from Worthy Foe, but backtracking. Now, this is on the cusp of the passive skill tree changes, as we've already seen. They have already messed with the routing of some of the nodes. Bex yesterday announced that Thick Skin is being linked this way, and they've moved some of these cluster around, so we're definitely getting some passive skill tree changes. They haven't confirmed it, but we are expecting some Ascendancy changes. This is before those changes, so everything I say now take with a grain of salt, and if Champion changes in any way, and the bottom right side of the tree improves in any way, then, you know, Champion could potentially be even more powerful than I'm already claiming that it is. So, a lot of people are aware that Fortify is a good mechanic. Well, it's a strong mechanic. Some people aren't a massive fan of it. Fortify grants 20% reduced damage taken. Now, whenever you consider reduced damage, you need to... it's not just a case of you just take 20% reduced. The more reduction you have, the more effective it is. Now, I'm no expert mathematician, but it's one of those things of if you ever actually Google how resistances work, how armor works, the difference between going from 0 to 10% damage reduction and the difference between going from 50 to 60% damage reduction is really huge. Damage reduction and Path of Exile, the more of it you can get, the more powerful it becomes. So whenever you just have blanket 20% reduction like this, it is much more powerful than it seems in many cases, especially when you start stacking it with additional sources, basalt flasks, etc. So, obviously, for bow builds are kind of my area of expertise. Some would argue not, but it's definitely my niche. It's what I play the most. You cannot easily acquire Fortify unless you're doing stupid stuff with weapon slots. Basically, you cannot get Fortify as a bow build unless you are a champion. Now, just considering the placement on the tree, you put yourself slightly out of the way by being a duelist, but in all honesty, the starting points really aren't that bad. These attack speed points, they don't feel amazing, but 12% attack speed for 3 points and getting some accuracy is good. We're all aware of how much builds struggle getting life on the right side of the tree, and these life nodes, while not the best life nodes in the world, they're still life nodes, and they give evasion and armor, and they could potentially be getting even better in the upcoming patch. So Duelist Start is actually much easier to work into bow builds than, for example, Marauder Start, because it doesn't shuffle you along. The starting points may not be the most efficient in the world, but your placement on the tree is still perfectly suited to making a bow-based character. And this whole argument will be, you know, centered around, is Champion underrated for bow builds? Okay. So, with that in mind, you're taking a Ascendancy which has very strong defensive purpose and is well centered into the tree. Now, the last time I played a champion was early this league, and I was doing Corsair carry. And for my Corsair character, I was doing Queen of the Forest because there's just loads of evasion scaling all over, you know, champion as a whole. And we're all aware of how powerful Queen of the Forest is. Movement speed directly correlates to, you know, avoidance when you're playing a dodge-based character, an evasion-based character. Oftentimes, it's better to just not get hit in the first place than to, you know, start rolling the dice. So there's very good synergy between this and Queen of the Forest. Queen of the Forest is very popular at the moment. And for that particular Corsair carry build, I was doing these two nodes and these two nodes. And people were saying, but Tarke, why don't you take Conqueror and Worthy Foe? Now, to be honest, I'm one of the many people who didn't really actually sit down and look at Conqueror and Worthy Foe when they first got their changes. They're a lot more powerful than they realistically seem. Right. Now, more evasion rating and armor, taunt duration, whatever. Now, 25% chance to taunt on hit. 6% reduced damage taken if you've taunted an enemy recently. 1% of life regen per second if you've taunted an enemy recently. Now, we'll work bottom up. Now, the 1% life regen is actually a lot more important than people give credit. Most trees following this kind of base outline where they get Golem's Blood, they get Mastery of the Arena on the way to Sun Life, and they pick up Heart of Oak, they nearly always sit at 3.6% life regen unless they go into Marauder Start. Now 3.6% life regen is just under the 4% of blood rage, meaning if you run blood rage, you're always negatively degenning. Now, by itself, that isn't that noticeable, but the second you start running, vulnerability maps, half regen maps, it becomes incredibly frustrating and really, really annoying. That 1% regen is enough to mean that blood rage is less of an issue. Yes, it's not always active, but with that plus your leech, it makes running blood rage in the half regen maps much less of a nuisance. So that's by itself is just already very powerful on a defensive / utility aspect. Now, the 6% reduced damage taken if you've taunted an enemy recently, we've already discussed how powerful damage reduction is once you start stacking it on top of each other. This 6% reduced damage taken makes our previous damage reduction even more efficient. You start stacking Conqueror plus Fortify plus Basalt Flasks, Lightning Coil maybe, and Taste of Hate or whatever your just general max resistances. You start working on these things in, and suddenly these scary one-shots, the main weakness of life versus CI, ignoring all the bullshit Vaal Discipline arguments, is volatiles. Bullshit one-shots. I played a 7.2k HP character early this league, and it got straight one-shot by a volatile. Now you could say, but Tarke, you're a bow build. Volatiles never get close to range characters. If that is your argument, then you clearly aren't playing this game, because there is always that one mob which randomly gets in your grill and then explodes. This is a game where it's all about pushing forward as aggressively and as quickly as possible. If you're a hardcore player, there'll be something. You shoot ahead, you blink forward, and something will happen. There'll be a mob underground, some shenanigan bullshit. At some point, you'll be hit by a volatile. At some point, that boss will clop you on the head. At some point, that random rare skelly is just going to go tap. Having all this stuff stacked together is incredibly powerful. Okay, but you say, but Tarke, I already knew that Champion was a very strong defensive choice. The problem is it does no damage. Well, this is another thing that people aren't really taking into account. So, more evasion and armor, which is obviously very powerful if you're doing stuff with Queen of the Forest or Iron Reflexes or just generic evasion scaling. And then Worthy Foe. Enemies you taunt take 20% increased damage. This is the exact same wording as Shock. If a node ever says enemies take increased damage, that is the equivalent of more damage. So this is enemies you taunt 20% more damage. So this is obviously very powerful when you start thinking about double dipping, and we think, well, what's kind of like the go-to meta for bow builds? Poison. What have they announced? Poison's going to survive 2.6. In the interview with Ziggy, Chris himself says it is unlikely that double dipping will be addressed in 2.6 or Massive Underline or 3.0. So it's not even confirmed that double dipping is getting fixed anytime remotely soon. Now, even ignoring double dipping, 20% more damage is very, very powerful, especially when you consider the fact that you're getting 26% damage reduction plus this 20% more. Also, enemies you taunt deal 10% less damage against other targets. So this is 10% blanket damage reduction for anyone you're partied with. Now, next league, I will be starting as a duo. I'll be doing me and one other friend. And, obviously I need to see how the changes happen. I need to see the new tree. But I'm seriously considering Champion for my league starters. Champions have always been good league starters. They are incredibly defensive. And the second you start factoring in group bonuses and the fact that this 20% more damage, this is global. This will apply to my allies. That damage reduction applies to my allies. So even though I personally won't benefit from that 10% reduction from Worthy Foe, I'm already getting 26% reduction from the rest of the tree. Now, there's also one other thing which I find kind of interesting, and there are a few confusing things about Champion which need clarification. Now, if you go on the Path of Exile wiki, taunts cause an affected enemy to focus aggro, spells, attacks, movement on the character that inflicted it for 3 seconds. Now, it'll be longer, obviously, because we have all the taunt duration. Taunted enemies deal 10% less damage to targets that aren't the source of the taunt. Now, there's very little info on taunt, but I would assume that this 10% less stacks with the 10% less that we get from Champion. So the person I'm duoing with, if I'm playing a Champion, gets 20% damage reduction every time I taunt a target. Assuming this stacks correctly, and I would assume so considering what it says on the wiki, obviously this is something you need to test yourself, although it's kind of hard to test, is interesting. The other thing is the way that it interacts with stuff like totems. Now, I did a bunch of reading on the forums, and I got a lot of mixed answers, and some of these nodes I know definitely work with totems, some of them I'm not sure about. Now, if you use a ranged attack totem, a siege ballista, an ancestral wall sheath totem, basically any attack-based totem, you can do spellcaster totems, but you're most likely not going to be doing duelists for that, but any attack-based totem build. Conqueror, that chance to taunt on hit, applies to your totems. So if you're playing any kind of totem-based build, having Conqueror gives your totems taunt, which defensively is very, very strong. Now, I've had people confirm on forums and threads that the 6% damage reduction you get from Conqueror, you get that bonus even if your totem taunts something, which seems weird to me, but enough people are backing it up that I assume it is correct. Again, this is something which needs clarification. If you know more on this matter, please let me know. And this is where it gets interesting. So the exact wording is, if you've taunted an enemy recently, and apparently totems proc that, which makes me ask the question, how would totems interact with worthy foe? Now, the wording is slightly different. This is enemies you, and this is enemies you've, but, I mean, they kind of mean the same thing. You and you've. I would assume both of those mean coming from you, this guy. So, if I have a totem that taunts, do I get the 10% less damage reduction from worthy foe? I'm not sure. If that is the case, then champion becomes even more powerful, because then this is another 10% damage reduction you're getting for yourself. Now, this is mostly just, I've seen what people have said on Reddit and on forums, and some people think it does, some people think it doesn't. We need clarification. Someone with more time can test it in PvP or something, but this is all extra food for thought. Without worthy foe, you're still getting 26% damage reduction. You're getting a global 20% more damage, which you can give to allies, and you're giving your allies 10% damage reduction. Potentially, if worthy foe interacts interestingly with totems, with clever totem usage in boss fights, you can get yourself 36% damage reduction, which is obviously pretty fucking absurd. Now, all of this is subject to be improved. No one is going to be nerfing champion going into the next patch. It is a very, very underrepresented class. And next time you think about an Ascendancy for hardcore, or even softcore if you're doing solo Southbound, maybe give the champion another look. Now, we will be getting the development manifesto tomorrow, and hopefully in that we'll get some inklings on whether or not there'll be Ascendancy changes, but we'll just have to wait until then. Today is the 22nd, tomorrow will be the 23rd. We'll have to wait for the whole New Zealand time gate, but I'm pretty happy because the 23rd is my birthday. So for my birthday, we'll hopefully be getting some Ascendancy changes. PogChamp. I'm Tarke, that's a champion. Have a good day. Bye-bye.